"Buy me, and I'll heal you," said the Virgin to the broken mountain man. What happened next stunned. A freezing storm sweeps through a lawless frontier town. A broken mountain man steps out of the shadows, scarred, limping, and done with mercy. Then he hears it. A trembling young woman is being sold for whiskey in the muddy street. The crowd laughs until she turns, looks right at him, and says, "Buy me, and I'll heal you." He does. But when the fever leaves his body that night, he realizes she wasn't lying. Soon she's mending more than wounds. She's touching something buried deep in his soul. But then the law rides in, saying she's a wanted thief and a liar, and worse, the men he once fought beside are coming for her bounty. Now faith and blood will test what healing truly means. Was she sent by God to save a lost man, or to expose the sins he thought were buried forever? When mercy costs everything, will he still believe she was heaven sent? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The snow whirled like angry spirits around the Red Elk Saloon, coating the muddy street in treacherous white. Gideon Stroud hunched deeper into his buffalo coat, his one good eye narrowing against the bitter wind. The last thing he'd expected when riding down from his cabin for supplies was to find himself in the middle of this sorry spectacle. A crowd of miners and drifters formed a loose circle outside the saloon's swinging doors, their raucous laughter carrying over the storm's howl. In the center stood a man with a bottle in his fist, swaying as he gestured to a woman beside him. Gideon's stomach turned as he realized what was happening. $5, the drunk man bellowed, gripping the woman's arm. "Who'll give me $5 for my dear sister? Room and board included, plus whatever's left of this here whiskey." He took another swig, whiskey dribbling down his chin. The woman, Gideon could see now she was young, perhaps in her early 20s, stood straight-backed despite the humiliation. Her dark hair whipped in the wind, and her dress, though worn, was neat and proper. There was something in her bearing that spoke of both Apache and white blood, a grace that seemed out of place in this crude gathering. $3, someone shouted. $3.50. The bidding continued, each offer accompanied by crude suggestions that made Gideon's jaw clench. He should ride on. Whatever trouble this was, it wasn't his concern. He'd learned the hard way that getting involved only brought more pain. But something held him there. Maybe it was the way the woman held herself, dignity intact even as her stepbrother tried to sell her like a piece of livestock. Or maybe it was the memory of other injustices he'd witnessed, back when he wore a uniform and followed orders he'd never forgive himself for. $4 came, another call, followed by whoops and hollers. The woman, he heard someone call her Ava, didn't flinch, though her eyes searched the crowd. When they found Gideon, something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or a plea. $4.50. The bidding continued. Gideon's hand moved to the leather pouch at his belt. The money was meant for ammunition and coffee, supplies he sorely needed. But his voice rose before he could stop himself. $5. The crowd fell silent, turning to stare at the scarred mountain man they usually gave wide berth to. The stepbrother squinted through the falling snow. "Well, if it ain't the ghost of Granite Ridge himself." He laughed, but there was uncertainty in it. $5 from the one-eyed hermit. Any other takers? The silence stretched. No one else bid. Perhaps it was the storm's increasing fury, or maybe it was Gideon's reputation. But the crowd began to disperse, heading back into the warmth of the saloon. The stepbrother stumbled forward, eager to complete the transaction before Gideon changed his mind. But Ava moved first, stepping away from her brother's grasp with fluid grace. She approached Gideon, her dark eyes meeting his single one without fear. "Buy me," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind, "and I'll heal you." Gideon's hand tightened on his money pouch. There was something in her words that reached past his carefully constructed walls, touching a wound deeper than his missing eye or the scars that marked his body. Without a word, he counted out $5 and held it out to the stepbrother, who snatched it greedily. The man turned away without even a goodbye to Ava, already heading for the saloon's warm interior. Gideon turned to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood patient in the storm. He gathered the reins, then looked at Ava. "My cabin's half a day's ride up Granite Ridge. Storm's getting worse. There's a line shack about 2 hours from here where we can wait it out." Ava nodded, pulling her thin shawl tighter. Without hesitation, she accepted his help, mounting behind him on the horse. Her arms wrapped around his waist, careful but secure, as they headed out of town. The storm grew fiercer as they rode, the wind driving ice-sharp snow into their faces. Gideon felt Ava shivering behind him and urged the horse faster. The old line shack was their only hope of shelter before nightfall. They rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Gideon wondered what madness had possessed him to spend his last dollars on this strange woman with her talk of healing. He'd given up on healing, of body or soul, long ago after Sand Creek, after everything he'd seen and done. The light was failing when they finally reached the line shack, a sturdy if weather-beaten structure tucked against a stand of pine trees. Gideon helped Ava dismount, her movements stiff from cold and hours of riding. He led the horse to the lean-to beside the shack, making sure the animal was protected from the worst of the storm. Inside, the shack was cold but dry. A quick search revealed some old firewood and matches left by previous visitors. Soon, Gideon had a small fire going in the pot-bellied stove, its warm glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. Ava stood by the stove, warming her hands. In the flickering light, Gideon could see her more clearly, the proud set of her chin, the wisdom in eyes too old for her years, the way she carried herself like someone used to helping others rather than accepting help. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. "Buy me?" Gideon busied himself arranging his saddlebags, buying time before answering. "Couldn't leave you to that crowd." He paused. "Your stepbrother? He done that before?" "No." She shook her head. "But the whiskey's been getting worse since Ma died. I've been praying for a way out." A small smile touched her lips. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Gideon grunted, uncomfortable with talk of prayers and providence. He'd seen too much evil to put much stock in either. "What did you mean, about healing?" Ava moved away from the stove, settling on a rough wooden chair. "I'm a healer. Learned from my grandmother. She was Western Apache, knew all the old ways. My mother taught me about faith healing too before she passed. I can see the wounds you carry, Mr. Stroud. Not just the eye, but deeper." "Some things can't be healed," Gideon said roughly, turning away to stare into the fire. "Everything can be healed," Ava replied quietly, "if you're willing to let it be." The wind howled outside, rattling the shack's walls. Inside, the silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken histories and the weight of their strange bargain. Gideon stood by the fire, his scarred face half in shadow, while Ava watched him with those knowing eyes. They were two unlikely companions, thrown together by circumstance, or perhaps, as Ava might say, by divine intention. A scarred warrior who'd lost his faith in everything but solitude, and a healer who saw past his wounds to something worth saving. As the storm raged outside, they settled in for the night, each wondering what path had led them to this moment, and where it might lead next. Gideon stretched out on his bedroll near the door, leaving Ava the shack's single cot. Sleep was slow to come, as they lay in the darkness, each aware of the other's presence, each pondering the strange twist of fate that had brought them together in this snowbound shelter. The fire's warmth filled the small space, and gradually the howling wind became a lullaby. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now they had found refuge from the storm, both the one outside and perhaps the ones within their hearts as well. Morning painted the mountains in soft rose and gold, the storm's fury replaced by pristine stillness. Fresh snow blanketed the landscape, transforming the rugged terrain into something almost holy. Ava stood in the line shack's doorway, breathing in the crisp air while Gideon readied the animals for their journey. "My mule can carry you," Gideon said, adjusting the saddle on the sturdy brown animal. "Horse needs rest after yesterday's run." Ava nodded, gathering her few belongings. She watched as Gideon moved about his tasks, noting how he favored his right leg. His movements were precise but pained, each step careful and measured. Her healer's eyes didn't miss the slight sheen of sweat on his brow despite the morning chill. The climb to Granite Ridge would be steep, the trail narrow and treacherous. Gideon helped Ava mount the mule, his hands respectfully distant. The animal's sure footing would serve them well on the precarious path ahead. They set out as the sun climbed higher, Gideon leading on foot while Ava rode. The mule picked its way carefully through the fresh snow, following a trail that seemed invisible to all but its master. Around them, the wilderness stretched vast and empty, broken only by stands of pine and bare-branched aspen. Ava began to hum softly, an old hymn her grandmother had taught her. The melody floated on the mountain air, mixing with the crunch of snow under boots and hooves. Gideon glanced back once, his expression unreadable, but he didn't ask her to stop. "Amazing Grace," she explained during a brief rest. "Grandmother said music helps the healing spirits find their way?" Gideon grunted, taking a careful sip from his canteen. His limp had grown more pronounced over the morning hours, and Ava could see the fabric of his right pant leg was darker near his calf, the wound weeping through its bandage. "You need tending," she said simply. "Been managing fine," he replied, though his jaw was tight with pain. Ava switched to another hymn, this one in Apache, her grandmother's native tongue. The foreign words seemed to float more easily in the thin mountain air, a prayer carried on melody. As they continued their ascent, she wove together songs learned at her grandmother's knee, some Christian, some Apache, all speaking to the great spirit of healing that knew no boundaries of faith or culture. The day wore on, the sun tracking across the crystal-clear sky. Gideon's pace slowed gradually but steadily, his limp becoming more pronounced with each hour. Still, he pressed forward with grim determination, speaking only to warn of difficult patches in the trail or to check on Ava's comfort. By late afternoon, the trail grew steeper still, switching back and forth across the mountainside. The air grew thinner, and Ava could see Gideon's breath coming in sharp bursts, his face pale beneath his beard despite the exertion. "How much further?" she asked quietly. "Round that ridge," he gestured to a rocky outcropping ahead. "Cabins in a protected hollow just beyond." The last mile was the hardest. Gideon's steps became increasingly unsteady, though he waved off Ava's offers to walk. The sun was setting by the Ori. Time they crested the final rise, painting the snow-covered hollow in deep purple and gold. The cabin sat nestled against the mountainside, solid and weather-worn. A thin trail of smoke rose from its stone chimney. The result, Gideon explained shortly, of banking the fire before heading to town. Near the cabin stood a small barn, its door sealed against the mountain weather. "Home sweet home," Gideon muttered, helping Ava down from the mule. His hands trembled slightly, and she could feel the heat of fever through his grip. "The animals can wait," she said firmly. "That leg needs tending first." Gideon started to protest, but Ava had already taken charge, steering him toward the cabin door. Inside, the space was simple but orderly. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves lined with preserved foods and supplies. "Sit," she commanded, stoking the banked fire to life. "Where do you keep your medical supplies?" Gideon sank heavily into one of the chairs, his usual stoicism cracking under the weight of fever and exhaustion. "Box under the bed. Not much there." Ava found the box, her heart sinking at its meager contents. But she had other resources. From her own bundle, she withdrew several packets of dried herbs and a small pot of salve. "These pants need cutting away from the wound," she said, kneeling beside his chair. When he didn't object, she took his silence for consent and began working carefully with a pair of scissors from the medical box. The wound, when finally exposed, made her breath catch. The old injury, a bullet wound by the look of it, was angry and inflamed, the infection having taken deep hold. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Got shot near 3 years ago. Never healed, right?" His voice was rough with pain and something else. Shame, perhaps, at being seen in such weakness. Ava worked methodically, cleaning the wound with water she'd heated over the fire. Her movements were gentle but sure, her touch careful but confident. As she worked, she began to pray softly, weaving together English and Apache words in a melody as old as healing itself. Gideon sat rigid at first, his whole body tense. But as Ava continued her ministrations, applying a poultice of herbs and her grandmother's salve, his muscles began to relax incrementally. Her voice washed over him, soothing as summer rain, and for the first time in years, he felt the iron bands of pain around his leg begin to loosen. "There," she said finally, securing a clean bandage around his calf. "That should help with the fever. But you need rest now." To her surprise, Gideon didn't argue. He allowed her to help him to the bed, even accepted the cup of herbal tea she brewed. Outside, snow had begun falling again, thick flakes drifting past the window in the gathering dark. "The animals," he mumbled, already half asleep. "I'll tend them," she promised. "Rest now. Let the healing work." She waited until his breathing steadied into sleep before pulling on her shawl and heading out to the barn. The mule and horse were glad to see her, and she made sure they were properly stabled and fed before returning to the cabin. Through the night, she kept watch by the fire, periodically checking Gideon's fever and changing the poultice. He slept deeply, and she noticed his usual restless movements, which she'd observed in the line shack, were absent. No nightmares seemed to trouble his rest. Dawn came softly, seeping through the cabin's small windows. Ava, who had dozed in the chair by the fire, woke to find Gideon watching her, his single eye clear and alert. "The fever's broken," he said, wonder in his voice. He sat up carefully, testing his leg. The pain was still there, but different, clean and healing rather than hot and poisoned. Ava smiled, relief flooding her features. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said simply. Gideon looked away, but not before she caught the moisture in his eye. "Reckon he does at that," he said gruffly. "Reckon he does?" Morning light filtered through the cabin's grimy windows, casting dim shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Ava stood in the center of the single room, taking stock of her surroundings with careful consideration. The cabin, while solidly built, bore the marks of years of solitary male habitation, dust thick in corners, cobwebs festooning the ceiling beams, and curtains hanging in threadbare tatters. She found an old broom behind the door and began sweeping, working methodically from the far corner toward the hearth. Gideon sat in his chair by the fire, his wounded leg propped on a stool, watching her with a mixture of wariness and confusion. "Ain't necessary to fuss," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Ava paused in her sweeping, meeting his gaze steadily. "A clean home helps healing, body and spirit alike." She resumed her work, humming softly as she swept years of dust toward the door. The morning passed in quiet industry. After sweeping, Ava discovered a basket of neglected mending supplies beneath a pile of worn blankets. She settled by the window, where the light was strongest, and began repairing the ragged curtains. "My grandmother always said idle hands make poor medicine," she explained, her needle flashing in the winter sunlight. "Everything has purpose in God's plan, even these old curtains." Gideon watched her work, his expression unreadable. But he didn't object when she hung the mended curtains, their patched fabric somehow lending the cabin a touch of dignity it had long forgotten. Near midday, Ava set about preparing their meal. The cabin's stores were basic but adequate: dried venison, beans, and a few wrinkled potatoes. She set a pot of water to boil, adding careful portions of meat and vegetables. "It's not much," she apologized, stirring the thin stew. "But it will strengthen you." Before they ate, Ava bowed her head. "Lord, we thank you for this food and for the shelter of this home. Guide our hands to your work, amen?" She spoke the words simply, without ceremony, but they filled the cabin with a presence that made Gideon shift in his seat. The afternoon brought heavy clouds and the threat of more snow. Ava was adding wood to the fire when a soft knock at the door startled them both. Gideon reached instinctively for his rifle, but Ava was already moving to answer. On the threshold stood a boy of perhaps 10 years, small for his age, and shivering in clothes too thin for the mountain weather. His features spoke of mixed heritage, Ute and Anglo, and his eyes held the wariness of one used to harsh welcome. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Might you spare some food?" "No room here for strays," Gideon called gruffly from his chair. "Town's down the mountain." But Ava had already drawn the boy inside, noting his bluish lips and trembling hands. "I'm Ava," she said gently. "And you are?" "Micah," the boy answered, his eyes darting between Ava's kind face and Gideon's stern one. "Micah Thomas." "The storm's coming fast," Ava observed, leading Micah to the fire. "He needs to stay until it passes," she added, meeting Gideon's disapproving glare. A muscle worked in Gideon's jaw, but after a long moment he gave a sharp nod. "Your doing, your responsibility," he muttered. Ava served Micah a bowl of stew, which he ate with careful restraint despite his obvious hunger. As evening drew in, bringing with it the promised storm, she convinced the boy to share his story. He'd been living on his own since his parents died of fever on the trail months ago, surviving by doing odd jobs and trapping small game. "Ain't right for a child to be alone," Ava said softly, adding more wood to the fire. The lamp on the table cast a warm glow through the cabin, creating a circle of light that seemed to hold the mountain darkness at bay. As the wind howled outside, Ava began to tell stories of her own past, of her grandmother, a wise woman who had bridged 2 worlds with her healing gifts. "She was Western Apache," Ava explained, her fingers working at some mending as she spoke. "But she found truth in the Christian message of healing and hope. She taught me that all medicine begins with love." Micah listened intently, his young face serious in the lamplight. Even Gideon seemed to lean forward slightly, though he pretended to be focused on cleaning his rifle. "She taught me about plants that ease pain, prayers that comfort the spirit, and songs that help healing find its way," Ava continued. "But most important, she taught me to listen for God's purpose in all things." She set aside her mending, her expression growing more serious. "When I was 16, I made a vow to keep myself pure and dedicated to healing until God shows me where I truly belong. Some folks don't understand such promises, but Grandmother said that the strongest medicine comes from a vessel kept clean for its purpose." The cabin fell quiet, except for the crack of the fire and the moan of wind through the eaves. Micah had dozed off, curled in a blanket near the hearth. Ava glanced at Gideon and saw something shift in his expression, a softening around his eyes, a slight easing of the hard line of his mouth. "Your grandmother," he said finally, his voice rough with disuse. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Ava agreed softly. "She taught me that healing isn't just about mending bodies. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we carry inside." Gideon looked away, but not before Ava caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in his face, like ice beginning to thaw under spring sun. He said nothing more, but when Ava rose to bank the fire for the night, his good night held a warmth that hadn't been there before. Later, as Ava lay on her pallet near the fire, listening to Micah's soft breathing and the storm's fury, she offered up a silent prayer of thanks. The cabin was still humble, but it felt different now, as if the simple acts of sweeping and mending, of sharing food and stories, had awakened something long dormant within its walls. In his corner, Gideon slept more peacefully than he had in years, his dreams for once unmarred by old ghosts. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the cabin, something new and fragile had taken root, like the first green shoot breaking through winter soil, reaching toward the light. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the storm's fury spent at last. Sunlight sparkled across the fresh snow like scattered diamonds, and the air held that special stillness that comes after heavy weather. Icicles hung from the cabin's eaves, dripping steadily as the winter sun climbed higher. Gideon stood at his chopping block, his breath clouding in the cold air as he split logs for the depleted woodpile. Each swing of the axe sent sharp cracks echoing across the snow-blanketed clearing. His movements were practiced and efficient, but Ava noticed how he favored his right leg, his limp more pronounced with each passing hour. Near the lean-to shelter, Ava helped Micah tend to his pony, a scrappy little dun that had somehow survived the storm. The boy had admitted that morning that the animal had been limping before the weather turned. Now, as they examined the pony's leg, Ava found a nasty gash, partially healed but showing signs of infection. "See here," she showed Micah, gently probing the wound. "When dirt gets trapped inside, it needs to be cleaned proper, or the healing can't happen right." She reached into her medicine pouch and pulled out a small tin of salve. "This will draw out the poison." Micah watched intently as she demonstrated how to apply the medicine. "My ma used to doctor our animals," he said softly, "before the fever took her and Pa both." Ava squeezed his shoulder gently. "You're doing right by this pony. Your ma would be proud." Another crack of the axe drew her attention back to Gideon. His shirt was dark with sweat despite the cold, and his movements had grown stiffer. When he stumbled slightly on his bad leg, Ava had seen enough. "Micah, keep working with that salve like I showed you," she instructed, rising from her crouch beside the pony. "That leg needs attention," she called to Gideon as she approached the chopping block. Gideon's jaw tightened. "It's fine." "It's not," Ava countered firmly. "You're favoring it worse than yesterday, and the cold's not helping. Please let me treat it properly." For a long moment, Gideon stood frozen, axe half raised. Finally, he let the tool drop to the snow with a soft thump. "Stubborn woman," he muttered, but there was less bite in his tone than before. Inside the cabin, Ava had him sit by the fire while she gathered her supplies. The wound, when exposed, looked angry and hot. As she began cleaning it, she could feel tension radiating from him like heat from a stove. "This happened at Sand Creek," he said suddenly, his voice rough as creek gravel. Ava's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their careful work. She'd heard of the Sand Creek Massacre, of course, a peaceful camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho murdered by cavalry troops. The story was whispered around frontier fires as a warning of how far men could fall. "I was there," Gideon continued, staring into the flames. "Following orders we never should have followed. Killing people who should have been neighbors." His hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "Got this when a rifle backfired. Lost most of my sight in the left eye, too. Seemed like God's judgment at the time." The confession seemed to break something in him. His broad shoulders began to shake, and his next words came out choked. "They're screams. I still hear them some nights. Women, children. How does a man live with such things?" Ava's heart ached at the raw pain in his voice. Carefully, she set aside her medicines and took his calloused hands in hers. "There's a verse my grandmother loved," she said softly. "Mercy triumphs over judgment." That's what the Apostle James wrote, and he also said that if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just to forgive us. How can there be forgiveness for such things? Gideon's voice was barely a whisper. "The same way there's healing for wounded flesh," Ava answered. "Through grace we don't deserve, but God gives anyway. Through choosing to live different from here forward." She resumed treating his leg, working in peaceful silence as her words settled between them. When she finished, the sun had begun to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. That evening, after a simple supper, Gideon stepped outside alone. Ava watched through the window as he stood in the yard, his figure dark against the star-filled sky. His lips moved, and though she couldn't hear the words, she recognized the posture of prayer. Micah came to stand beside her at the window. "Is he talking to God?" the boy asked quietly. "Yes," Ava answered, her heart full. "I believe he is." When Gideon finally came back inside, his face looked different, as if some great weight had begun to lift. He nodded to them both before settling in his chair, and for the first time since Ava had known him, real peace seemed to fill the cabin's quiet spaces. They all slept deeply that night, wrapped in the profound silence that follows fresh snow. Dawn brought more clear skies and a sense that something had fundamentally shifted in their small world. Ava was teaching Micah to make biscuits, their hands dusty with flour, when they heard it, the sharp rhythm of hoofbeats carrying through the crisp morning air. Gideon was on his feet in an instant, his hand going to the rifle that never strayed far from his reach. The sound grew louder, echoing off the frozen slopes. Multiple horses, moving fast up the mountain trail. The hoofbeats grew louder, their rhythm steady against the frozen ground. Gideon moved to the cabin door, positioning himself between the approaching riders and Ava. His rifle rested easily in his hands, a familiar weight. Through the window, they could see 3 mounted figures emerging from the tree line. The lead rider sat tall in his saddle, his badge catching the morning sun. A United States Marshal's star. The other 2 men hung back, their poses suggesting seasoned lawmen rather than the rough bounty hunters Gideon had expected. "Stay inside," Gideon told Ava and Micah, his voice low but firm. He stepped out onto the porch, keeping his rifle pointed downward but ready. The marshal reined his horse to a stop in the yard, snow crunching beneath iron-shod hooves. He was an older man, his face weathered by years of frontier service, with sharp eyes that took in everything at once. "Morning," the lawman called out, I'm United States Marshal Clay Klein." He dismounted slowly, making no sudden moves. "Looking for a woman named of Ava Lanton." Gideon's grip tightened on his rifle. "What's your business with her?" Marshal Klein's hand rested casually near his holster. "Got a warrant out of Denver, theft and bigamy charges." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "She disappeared 3 weeks ago with a railroad payroll, nearly $2,000 missing." Inside the cabin, Ava's sharp intake of breath was audible in the morning stillness. Gideon kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced. The gentle healer who'd brought warmth back to his home. A thief? It didn't square with what he'd seen of her character. "Bigamy?" Gideon questioned, his voice hard. According to the complaint, she was promised in marriage to the railroad's foreman, then vanished with another man, and the money. The marshal's tone was matter-of-fact. "That second charge might not stick, but the theft is serious business." The cabin door creaked open behind Gideon. Before he could stop her, Ava stepped out onto the porch. She stood straight and dignified, though Gideon could see her hands trembling. "I've done no wrong in God's eyes, Marshal," she said quietly, "though men might see it different." Marshal Klein studied her carefully. "Ma'am, I've got 2 more pauses following my trail. Bounty hunters, not lawmen, and they won't be as civilized about this as I am. Best you come with me now, explain yourself to the judge." "She's not going anywhere." Gideon's voice was like iron. "Not until we know the truth of this." The marshal's deputies shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. But Klein held up a staying hand. His eyes moved from Gideon's rifle to Ava's calm face, to young Micah peering anxiously through the window. "Tell you what," Klein said finally, "I've got to ride down to Red Elk anyway. Confirm some details about this warrant. I'll be back in 2 days." He mounted up, gathering his reins. "But those bounty hunters won't wait, and they won't care much about asking questions first." "Much obliged for the warning," Gideon replied stiffly. They watched the lawmen ride away, their horses' hoofprints marking fresh tracks in the snow. Only when they disappeared into the trees did Gideon lower his rifle and turn to Ava. She stood hugging herself against more than just the cold, her face troubled. "You should have let them take me," she whispered. "Now you'll be in danger too." "Come inside," Gideon said gruffly. "Reckon it's time we heard the whole story." Back in the cabin's warmth, Ava sank into a chair by the fire. Micah brought her a cup of water, hovering protectively nearby. The boy had grown attached to her these past days, Gideon noticed. "It started 3 weeks ago," Ava began, her voice soft but steady. "I was traveling with my healing medicines, like always. Came upon a railroad camp where fever was running through the workers. Their foreman, Mr. Burke, was the sickest of all." She twisted her hands in her skirt. "I stayed 2 weeks, nursing them. Most recovered. Mr. Burke..." Her voice caught. "He recovered too well. Started talking about marriage, saying God had sent me to him. But there was something wrong in his eyes when he spoke of God." Gideon could imagine the type. He'd seen plenty of men use religion to mask darker purposes. "One night," Ava continued, "he came to my tent, said he'd made arrangements with a preacher that we'd be married next day whether I wished it or not. He had my grandmother's medicine pouch in his hands. Said he'd burn it if I refused." Angry color touched her cheeks at the memory. "I managed to get away that night. His strongbox was open on his desk. There was money there, the payroll, I learned later. I took it." Her eyes met Gideon's squarely. "I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid and angry. I told myself I'd use it for good, helping others until I could pay it back somehow." "And the bigamy charge?" Gideon asked quietly. "Pure spite," Ava said bitterly. "He couldn't bear to admit I'd refused him. Easier to say I'd run off with another man." Silence filled the cabin as her story settled around them. Gideon studied her face, remembering how she'd prayed over his wounds, how she'd welcomed Micah without hesitation, how her gentle strength had begun healing more than just his physical hurts. "I believe you," he said finally. Tears spilled down Ava's cheeks. "I've asked God's forgiveness for the theft every day," she whispered. "But I couldn't. I couldn't let that man—" "You don't have to explain further." Gideon's voice was gentle but firm. "We'll figure this out." He moved to check his rifle, his mind already working on plans. "I know these mountains better than any bounty hunter. We can hide you until Marshal Klein returns. See if he's willing to hear the truth." "But what if he's not?" Micah spoke up from his corner. "What if he tries to take Miss Ava anyway?" Gideon met Ava's eyes across the room. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes. For now, you're safe here." Ava wiped her tears, squaring her shoulders. "I won't bring trouble to your door, Gideon. You've done enough already." "Reckon that's my choice to make?" He checked the cabin's windows, already planning the best routes to his backup shelters. "Besides, seems to me you were sent here for a purpose. Don't think it was just to heal my leg." "Could be you were sent to help her too," Micah offered quietly. "Like in them Bible stories Miss Ava tells, where God puts the right people together when they need each other most." Something warm flickered in Gideon's chest at the boy's words. He'd stopped believing in divine providence after Sand Creek, but these past days with Ava had begun shifting something deep inside him. Maybe the boy had the right of it. "First thing," he said practically, "we need to get you somewhere safer than this cabin. I know a place up higher where the bounty hunters won't think to look." He began gathering supplies, his movements swift and sure. "Micah, you help Miss Ava pack what medicines she'll need. I'll get the horses ready." As they prepared to move to safer ground, Gideon kept watch out the windows, alert for any sign of approaching riders. But his thoughts were on Ava's story, and the look in her eyes when she'd spoken of using the stolen money for good. He recognized that need for redemption, that desperate hope that enough good deeds might balance out past wrongs. He'd been searching for his own redemption since Sand Creek. Maybe, he reflected, helping Ava find hers might lead him closer to his own. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in pale gold as 3 riders wound their way higher into the valley. Gideon led them along a narrow deer trail, his good eye scanning the terrain ahead, while his damaged one remained fixed in its unseeing stare. Behind him, Ava rode his mule with their supplies, while young Micah brought up the rear on his pony. The morning air bit sharp and clean. Fresh snow blanketed the slopes, unmarred by any tracks save their own. Twisted pines cast long shadows across their path, and somewhere in the distance, a lone eagle screamed its greeting to the sun. "Not much further now," Gideon called back softly. "Trail opens up past these rocks." They emerged from a narrow passage between weathered granite boulders into a hidden meadow. At its far edge, tucked against the tree line, stood a small log cabin. Years of harsh winters had darkened its walls to a deep brown, and part of its roof sagged from neglect, but its walls looked solid enough. "My old trapping cabin," Gideon explained as they approached. "Haven't used it in 2 seasons. Nobody else knows it's here." Ava took in the cabin and the frozen creek that wound past it. "It's perfect," she said quietly. "Thank you, Gideon." He merely nodded, already dismounting to check the cabin's interior. Finding it secure if dusty, they began unloading their supplies. Micah proved especially helpful, organizing their goods with careful attention, while Ava swept years of dust from the floor and Gideon assessed the roof damage. By midday, they had made the cabin livable. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the scent of coffee mixed with the pine fresh air drifting through the newly cleaned windows. Ava had hung her dried herbs from the rafters, their subtle fragrances adding something homelike to the rustic space. "Micah," she called, pulling something from her pack. "Would you help me with this?" The boy came over to where she sat by the fire. In her hands was Gideon's worn Bible, its leather cover smooth from years of handling. "I noticed you watching when I read the prayers," she said gently. "Would you like to learn?" Micah's eyes widened. "You'd teach me? Really?" "Of course." She patted the bench beside her. "Everyone should be able to read God's words for themselves." From his work on the roof, Gideon paused to watch through the open door as Ava began teaching Micah the basic letters. Her patience seemed endless as she guided the boy's finger across the pages, helping him sound out simple words. The sight stirred something in his chest, something he hadn't felt since before the war. The days that followed settled into a peaceful rhythm. Each morning, Gideon checked their surroundings for any sign of pursuit before starting his work on the roof. The old shakes needed replacing, and he took his time, wanting to ensure they'd have proper shelter if they needed to stay through winter. Ava spent her mornings with Micah, teaching him not only reading, but also the proper uses of her healing herbs. The boy proved an eager student, especially when she explained how each plant was a gift from the Creator for helping his children. In the afternoons, she would venture out to gather what herbs still grew in the sheltered places, always returning before dusk to lead them in prayer before their evening meal. Gideon found himself looking forward to those prayer times, though he rarely spoke the words himself. There was something comforting in the ritual, in Ava's clear voice giving thanks for their safety and daily bread. Micah would bow his head solemnly beside her, occasionally peeking to make sure he was doing it right. They were becoming something like a family, Gideon realized one evening as he watched them. The thought should have frightened him, but instead it filled some empty place he'd carried since Sand Creek. It was on their fourth night in the cabin that Ava finally shared her full story. They sat around the fire after supper, the windows dark with night, when she began speaking softly. "I need you to understand everything," she said, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "About what happened at the railroad camp." Gideon set aside his coffee cup, giving her his full attention. Even Micah stopped whittling the stick he'd been working on. "Burke, the foreman, he'd been watching me for days while I tended the sick," she continued. "I thought it was just concern for his men at first, but then I'd catch him following me when I gathered herbs, or standing outside my tent at night." She drew a shaky breath. "He'd talk about God's will, about how a woman needed a man's protection. But his eyes, they were like a wolf's eyes." Gideon's hand tightened on his cup, but he kept silent, letting her speak. "That last night he'd been drinking. He came to my tent, said he'd arranged everything with a preacher in town, said we'd be married tomorrow, that it was already decided." Her voice grew harder. "When I refused, he grabbed my grandmother's medicine pouch, my most sacred possession, said he'd burn it, then dragged me toward his cabin." She looked up, meeting Gideon's gaze directly. "I fought him. He wasn't expecting that from a woman who spent her days praying and tending the sick. When he fell, I saw his strongbox open on the desk. The payroll money was right there, and I took it." Her shoulders straightened. "I told myself I'd use it to help others until I could pay it back somehow. That maybe God would understand." "He does," Micah said with a child's simple certainty. "You helped me, didn't you? And Mr. Gideon, too." A faint smile touched Ava's lips, but her eyes stayed on Gideon. "I made a vow that night," she continued, "that I would never marry unless God himself showed me the man, that my life would be given to healing and prayer, nothing else." Silence filled the cabin after her words. The fire popped and sparked, casting warm light across their faces. Finally, Gideon spoke. "I believe you," he said simply, "and I'll help you prove your innocence somehow." "You believe me?" Her voice held wonder. "Just like that?" "I've seen enough of men like Burke," Gideon replied, his voice rough with old memories. "Men who use God's name to cover their own evil. Besides," he added more softly, "I've watched you these past days. There's no dishonesty in you, Ava." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've carried this alone for so long." "Not alone anymore," Micah declared, moving to sit beside her. "We're like family now, ain't we, Mr. Gideon?" Gideon looked at them, the gentle healer and the brave boy who'd somehow worked their way past his defenses. "Reckon we are at that," he agreed quietly, "and family protects its own." Rising, he checked the cabin's windows and door one final time before banking the fire for the night. As he worked, he made silent promises to them both. He would keep them safe, would find a way to clear Ava's name, would give Micah the home he deserved. For the first time since Sand Creek, he had something worth fighting for, something worth believing in. That night, as wind whispered through the pines outside their snug cabin, all three slept peacefully. Their prayers mingled with their dreams, and the bonds between them grew stronger with each passing hour. They were no longer three lonely souls seeking shelter from the storm. They had become a family, forged in trust and strengthened by faith. The night wind howled fierce and cold against the cabin walls. Inside, Ava stirred the pot of rabbit stew while Micah practiced his letters by firelight. Gideon sat cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical in the lamp's glow. A heavy thump at the door made them all freeze. "Help!" The voice was barely human, more a rasp of desperation. "Please." Gideon grabbed his rifle, moving to the door with practiced caution. When he opened it, a man collapsed across the threshold, his face raw from wind and cold, his hands blue-white with frost. "Merciful Father," Ava breathed, already moving. "Micah, heat more water. Gideon, help me get him to the fire." Together they lifted the stranger, a trapper by his gear, and laid him near the hearth. His eyes were red and swollen, his lids nearly frozen shut. "Snow blindness," Ava murmured, checking his pulse, "and frostbite in both hands, bad in the right." She began pulling herbs from her medicine pouch. "I need willow bark, as much as we have, and clean cloths." Through the night, Ava worked tirelessly. She bathed the trapper's face with warm chamomile tea, easing his swollen eyes. But it was his right hand that worried her most, the flesh pale and hard, threatening to die. "We have to save it," she said, her voice firm with purpose. "Bring that pot of willow bark to a boil, Micah. Gideon, hold him steady. This will hurt him." For hours she worked, alternating hot willow bark poultices with gentle massage, coaxing life back into the frozen flesh. The trapper moaned and thrashed, but Gideon's strong hands kept him still. Micah helped without complaint, fetching water and herbs as needed. Dawn was breaking when the trapper's eyes finally opened. "I can see," he whispered hoarsely, "and my hand, I can feel it burning." "That's good," Ava smiled, exhausted but relieved. "The burning means it's alive. God has blessed us." The trapper stayed 3 days, regaining his strength. When he left, he could grip his rifle and see clearly enough to track his way home. "I won't forget this," he promised. "The healer who saved my hand. Folks should know about you." And know they did. Word spread through the mountain camps and valleys about the woman who worked miracles with prayer and herbs. Within 2 weeks, the first visitors arrived. 3 Ute women wrapped in wool blankets, their faces lined with worry. "We heard of you," the eldest said in careful English. "Our sister's child is very sick. Will you come?" Ava looked to Gideon, who nodded slowly. "I'll escort you," he said. "Micah can watch the cabin." The Ute camp lay half a day's ride away, nestled in a protected valley. Smoke rose from multiple lodges, and children paused in their play to watch the strangers approach. Several men stood guard, their expressions guarded but not hostile. The sick child lay in her mother's lodge, burning with fever. Ava knelt beside the small form, her hands gentle as she checked pulse and breathing. The girl couldn't have been more than 4 years old. "How long has she been ill?" Ava asked softly. 3 days, the mother answered. "She won't eat, just burns." Ava nodded, reaching for her medicine pouch. "I will need clean water and help gathering some herbs. They grow here. I saw them as we rode in." The women moved quickly to assist her. Outside, Gideon sat respectfully by the central fire, aware of the men watching him. He kept his hands visible and his movements slow, remembering old lessons about trust. As the day progressed, something shifted in the camp. The women worked alongside Ava, learning which herbs she sought and how to prepare them. They shared their own knowledge of local plants, which Ava accepted with genuine interest and gratitude. By sunset, the child's fever had broken. She took broth from her mother's hands and fell into natural sleep. A ripple of relief passed through the gathered families. The eldest woman who had first sought Ava's help approached Gideon. "You are the one they called Ghost of Granite Ridge," she said. It wasn't a question. "I was," he answered honestly. She studied him. "But now you guard our healer sister. You have changed." "She helped me see differently," he admitted. The woman nodded, then called to others in their language. Soon, venison was brought to the fire, along with cornbread and wild berries. "Share our meal," she invited them both. As they ate, Ava began humming one of her grandmother's hymns. The Ute women listened. Then one began singing words in their own tongue, a prayer of thanksgiving that matched the melody perfectly. Gideon watched in wonder as the songs merged, 2 languages praising the same creator. The firelight showed faces relaxed in shared fellowship, ancient barriers softening in the presence of genuine healing. When they prepared to leave the next morning, the women pressed gifts into Ava's hands, healing herbs, a beautifully beaded medicine pouch, and dried meat for their journey. "Come again," the eldest said. "You are welcome here." They rode home in thoughtful silence. Finally, Ava spoke. "Did you see how they knew that hymn?" "In their own words, yes." Gideon guided his horse around a fallen log. "Seems some songs belong to everyone?" "And some healing, too," she added softly. "Those women knew things about the local plants that even my grandmother hadn't taught me. We can learn from each other." They found Micah safe at the cabin, eager to hear about their journey. As Ava prepared dinner, hoofbeats approached again. But this time it was Marshal Klein riding up alone. Gideon met him outside, tense until he saw the lawman's relaxed posture. "Good news and bad," Klein said without preamble. "I've cleared your name, Stroud. Traced your whereabouts during that payroll theft. You weren't anywhere near it." "And Ava?" The marshal's face tightened. "That's the bad news. The railroad's still pressing charges. They want their money back, plus damages. And that foreman, Burke, he's hired bounty hunters. Mean ones." Gideon's hand moved to his rifle. "She's innocent." "Maybe so, but proving it won't be easy." Klein swung down from his horse. "Mind if I come in? We need to talk about options." Inside, they gathered around the table while Klein laid out the situation. The railroad was powerful, with friends in high places. Burke's reputation was solid with his employers, despite rumors about his treatment of women. But, the marshal added, looking at Ava, you're building quite a reputation yourself. Had some Ute riders tell me about you saving that child. Said you worked a miracle. God worked the miracle, Ava corrected quietly. I just helped. Well, whatever happened, it's got people talking. Indians and whites both speaking well of you. That's rare in these parts. He drummed his fingers on the table. Might be useful, if we can figure out how to use it. What are you suggesting? Gideon asked. Give me time, Klein replied. Let me gather more testimonies about her healing work. Meanwhile, stay alert. Those bounty hunters won't care about miracles. They just want the reward. After the marshal left, they secured the cabin for the night. But something had changed. A sense of both hope and urgency filled the air. Ava's gift was bringing healing to more than just bodies. It was building bridges between peoples long divided. Yet danger was closing in, threatening to destroy all they had built. As they gathered for evening prayers, Micah placed his hand in Ava's. God won't let them take you, he said with a child's certainty. You're doing his work. Ava squeezed his hand gently. We must trust his plan, she answered, and be grateful for the family he's given us to face it with. Gideon watched them, his scarred face thoughtful in the lamplight. Marshal Klein's words echoed in his mind. They would need more than just prayers to keep Ava safe. But perhaps those bridges she was building would prove stronger than any bounty hunter's greed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines as Gideon returned from checking his trap lines. His boots crunched through crusty snow as he approached the cabin, noting fresh deer tracks crossing his path. The peaceful scene shattered when he spotted something white beneath his door, a folded paper that hadn't been there when he'd left. His heart thudding, Gideon retrieved the telegram with stiff fingers. Inside, Marshal Klein's terse message confirmed his fears. Returning with witnesses stop. Cannot delay arrest warrant stop. 2 days time stop. The paper crackled in his tightening grip. Inside the cabin, he could hear Ava humming as she taught Micah his letters. The boy's voice carried through the door, carefully sounding out words from scripture. Gideon pushed inside, stamping snow from his boots. The warmth hit him first. Ava kept a good fire, then the smell of fresh bread and herbs drying in bundles from the rafters. Home. It had become home again, after so many empty years. You're back early, Ava noted, looking up from where she sat with Micah at the table. Her smile faded when she saw his expression. What's wrong? Wordlessly, he handed her the telegram. She read it quickly, her face growing still. Micah watched them both, his young features clouding with worry. They can't take you, the boy burst out. We won't let them. Ava folded the paper carefully. We knew this day might come, she said softly. I've prayed about it. We can leave, Gideon said roughly. I know places in the high country where they'd never find us. Cave systems, old mining camps. No. Ava's voice was gentle but firm. Running would only prove their lies about me, and it would shame you after Marshal Klein cleared your name. Shame be damned, Gideon growled, then caught himself. Sorry, but I won't let them lock you away for defending yourself against that foreman. God will show us the way, Ava answered. We must trust him and... She broke off as Micah suddenly began coughing. The harsh, wet sound filled the cabin. The boy doubled over, his face reddening as he struggled for breath. Ava was beside him instantly, her hand on his forehead. He's burning up, she said sharply. How long have you felt sick, Micah? Since morning, he gasped between coughs. Didn't want to worry anyone. Get him to bed, Ava ordered Gideon. I need my medicines. Gideon lifted the boy, alarmed at how hot his small body felt through his clothes. Micah's coughing grew worse as they settled him in the narrow bunk. His breath wheezed painfully in his chest. Ava worked swiftly, crushing dried herbs with practiced movements. "Pneumonia," she muttered. "The cold's settled in his lungs. We need to break the fever before it takes hold deeper." Through the long afternoon and into evening, she tended the sick child. She brewed strong teas of willow bark and sage, coaxing Micah to sip them between coughing fits. When his fever rose higher, she packed snow in cloth and laid it across his chest and forehead. Gideon helped where he could, keeping the fire stoked, heating water, supporting Micah's shoulders when the coughing grew violent. But mostly he watched Ava work, marveling at her quiet confidence even as fear gnawed at his gut. As night fell, Micah's breathing grew more labored. The boy tossed restlessly, calling out in delirium for his dead parents. Ava never left his side, bathing his face with cool snowmelt, praying constantly under her breath. "Please," she whispered, "great physician, heal this child. Show your mercy." Gideon stood helplessly by the window, watching darkness gather outside. The thought of losing Micah, this bright soul who'd brought such life to their strange household, was unbearable. Without conscious decision, he found himself kneeling beside Ava at the bed. "Lord," he said hoarsely, his voice rusty with disuse, "I ain't prayed proper in years, but if you're listening, this boy deserves to live. He's got good in him. And she—" His voice caught as he glanced at Ava's tear-streaked face. "She's done nothing but serve you, healing folks who needed it. Please, help us save him." Ava's hand found his in the darkness, squeezing gently. Together they maintained their vigil as Micah fought for each breath, his small chest heaving beneath the damp cloths. The night seemed endless. Gideon lost track of how many times Ava changed the snowpacks, how many cups of bitter tea she coaxed down Micah's throat. His own prayers grew more desperate as the hours crawled by, bargaining with God in ways he hadn't since the war. Near dawn, Micah's breathing suddenly changed. The harsh rattling eased, becoming deeper and more regular. Ava laid a hand on his forehead, then sagged with relief. "The fever's breaking," she whispered. "Feel." Gideon touched the boy's face. The burning heat had faded to normal warmth. Micah's color looked better too, the alarming flush replaced by healthy pink. As they watched, his eyes fluttered open. "Thirsty," he mumbled. Ava helped him sip fresh water, tears streaming silently down her face. Gideon found his own eyes growing damp as morning light began filtering through the frosted window, painting the room in soft gold. Micah drifted into natural sleep, his breathing easy and clear. Ava finally allowed herself to slump against the bed frame, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Thank you," Gideon said roughly, "for saving him, for everything." She shook her head. "God saved him. I just did what he showed me." "Then thank God for sending you to us." Gideon's voice was thick with emotion. "I reckon I finally understand what real faith looks like. What real love looks like, too." Ava met his gaze, her eyes bright with tears and something deeper. For a long moment they sat in silence, watching the sunrise paint the room in hope's colors, while Micah slept peacefully beside them. The telegram lay forgotten on the table, its threat temporarily overshadowed by the miracle they'd witnessed. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their unlikely family bound by something stronger than blood or law. Outside, the morning sun sparked rainbow colors in the frost-covered window panes, nature's own testimony to the power of healing and renewal. 2 days passed like whispers through the pines. The morning sun had barely cleared the ridge when hoofbeats echoed up the snowy trail. Gideon stood on his cabin porch, watching Marshal Clay Klein's approach with a hand resting near his belt. The lawman looked different somehow, worn down by more than just winter trails. His horse's flanks were caked with dried sweat, suggesting a hard ride. He dismounted slowly, hands visible, and nodded to Gideon. "Stroud," he said quietly. "The lady about?" "Inside," Gideon answered, not moving from his position. "Tending the boy. He's been sick." The marshal's weathered face showed a flicker of concern. "The half-Ute child? Nothing serious, I trust?" "Pneumonia. She saved his life." Gideon's voice carried pride and challenge both. "Like she's saved others." Klein studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "I need to inspect the cabin. My duty, you understand." Gideon's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. Inside, Ava sat beside Micah's bunk, reading from Gideon's old Bible. She looked up calmly as they entered, marking her place with a dried flower. "Marshal," she said softly, "God be with you." Klein removed his hat, revealing gray-streaked hair. "Ma'am, the boy doing better?" "By his grace, yes." She smoothed Micah's blanket. "Will you take some coffee before you do what you came for?" The marshal's shoulders slumped slightly. "That's kind, but no. Best get this done." He moved methodically through the cabin, checking corners and cupboards. Gideon watched with growing tension as Klein knelt to examine the floorboards. The lawman's fingers found a loose plank near the hearth. Time seemed to slow as he pried it up, revealing a space beneath. There, wrapped in oiled leather, lay a small pouch. Klein withdrew it carefully, weighing it in his hand before loosening the drawstring. Gold coins gleamed in the morning light, the missing railroad payroll. Gideon's heart thundered. "She didn't know," he said roughly. "I swear on my mother's grave, she—" "I put it there," Ava interrupted quietly. She stood, hands folded at her waist. "The day after you first brought me here." "Ava, no," Gideon started. "I won't lie, not even to save myself." Her voice remained steady. "I took the money when I fled, yes, but not for myself. I've been using small amounts to help widows on the reservation, women whose husbands died in the mines, leaving them with nothing, children who needed medicine. I kept records of every penny spent." She crossed to her trunk and withdrew a small notebook. The marshal took it, thumbing through pages of careful notation. Names, dates, amounts, all recorded in neat script. "The rest is there," Ava continued. "I always meant to repay it, once I found honest work. I couldn't leave those families to starve while that foreman kept offering money to own me." Klein's lined face gave nothing away as he studied the ledger. The cabin fell silent except for Micah's soft breathing and the crackle of the hearth. Finally, the marshal looked up. His eyes moved from Ava to Gideon, then to the sleeping boy. He took in the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the mended curtains, the fresh bread cooling on the table. "The women at the Ute camp spoke of you," he said slowly, "called you medicine sister, said you saved their children, asked nothing in return." He paused. "My late wife was half Cherokee. She used to say true healing comes from the heart, not the hands." Ava waited quietly, her face serene, despite the fear Gideon knew must be churning inside her. Klein closed the ledger with deliberate care. "I've seen where that payroll usually went. Whiskey, women, gambling. First time I've known it to feed widows and save lives." He tucked the leather pouch into his coat. "I'll report it repaid in full. The company's books will show no theft." "Marshal!" Gideon's voice cracked with relief. "Don't!" Klein held up a hand. "Some justice lives in mercy. My wife taught me that. though it took years to sink in. He settled his hat back on his head. Good day to you all. They watched from the doorway as he mounted up, leather creaking as he settled in the saddle. He paused, looking back at them. Miss Lanton, he said quietly, keep healing. God knows this territory needs it. With that, he turned his horse and rode away, taking the weight of the law with him. Gideon and Ava stood in the doorway long after his figure disappeared among the pines. Finally, she swayed slightly, the morning's tension catching up with her. Gideon steadied her with a gentle hand. You should have told me about the money, he said softly. I couldn't risk you lying for me. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Your soul's healing was too important. Something broke open in Gideon's chest, a final wall crumbling after years of careful construction. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. Ava, he said roughly, that day in Red Elk, you said you'd heal me if I bought you. But I reckon it was God who bought us both, paid for our healing with his own blood. She nodded, tears spilling over. His mercy is new every morning. Then I'm asking, not buying. Gideon's voice grew husky with emotion. Not because I owe you, but because my heart's finally whole enough to love right. Will you marry me? Ava's hands tightened in his. Are you certain? My path won't be easy. I've promised God to keep healing, wherever he sends me. I'm certain as sunrise, Gideon answered. Your path is mine now, if you'll have me. A smile bloomed across her face, bright as mountain wildflowers after snow. Yes, she whispered. But we must pray first. Seek his blessing. Together they knelt beside Micah's bunk, where the boy had woken and was watching them with shining eyes. Gideon bowed his head as Ava's clear voice rose in prayer, thanking God for healing, for mercy, for love restored. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the dried herbs and making them glow like benedictions. Outside, a spring wind touched the pines, carrying away the last traces of winter. Inside, 3 hearts beat in harmony, a family forged by grace, bound by something stronger than blood or law. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, catching dust motes that danced above the newly planed boards spread across sawhorses. Gideon ran his calloused hand along the smooth surface, checking for splinters. The fresh pine scent mixed with coffee brewing on the hearth, creating an atmosphere of peaceful industry. Table's coming along fine, he said, more to himself than anyone else. The old one had served its purpose, but 3 people needed more space for proper meals together. Ava looked up from where she sat mending near the window, her needle flashing in the light. It's beautiful work, she said softly. God gives different gifts to different hands. From his spot on the floor, Micah carefully guided his knife along a piece of pine, his tongue stuck out in concentration as he shaped what was slowly becoming a horse. Wood shavings curled around his boots like pale ribbons. Like this, Gideon. The boy held up his work, eager for approval. Gideon set down his plane and crouched beside him, examining the rough-hewn figure. Getting there. See how the neck curves? That's right natural looking. Pride bloomed across Micah's face. He bent back to his task with renewed focus, while Ava's clear voice lifted in song. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The familiar hymn filled the cabin with warmth as substantial as the sunlight. Gideon found himself humming along as he worked, something he hadn't done since before the war. His hands moved steadily across the wood, smoothing away rough edges just as time and grace had begun smoothing his own. The peaceful moment shattered at the sound of approaching horses. Gideon straightened, his body tensing as he moved to the window. 5 riders approached through the trees, their manner suggesting purpose rather than chance passing. His breath caught as recognition struck. Faces he hadn't seen since Sand Creek, now older and harder. "Iva," he said quietly, "take Micah to the back room." She gathered her sewing without argument, guiding the boy away from the window. But she paused in the doorway, her eyes meeting Gideon's. "Remember whose you are now," she said softly. The riders pulled up outside, dust settling around their horses' hooves. Their leader, a weathered man with a cavalry mustache, dismounted first. Gideon knew him as Lieutenant Morris, though he doubted that rank still held. "Stroud," Morris called out. "Long time since Sandy. Creek." Gideon stepped onto the porch, keeping his stance relaxed despite the weight of memory. "Didn't expect to see you boys up this way." "Wouldn't be, except for interesting news out of Red Elk." Morris hooked his thumbs in his belt. "Word is you're harboring a certain lady, one worth $300 to the right parties." The amount hung in the air like gun smoke. Gideon's voice remained level. "No one here for sale." "Now, Stroud, don't get territorial. We're just doing honest business." Morris gestured expansively. $300 split 5 ways ain't much, but times are lean. Why not step aside, let us collect, for old times' sake?" "Those times are dead and buried." Gideon's good eye fixed on his former commander. "Best ride on." A younger man with a star-shaped scar spat tobacco juice in the dirt. "Getting soft in your old age, Stroud? Time was you'd have helped us drag her out." "That's right," another added. "Remember that Apache camp? You didn't hesitate then." Shame and anger warred in Gideon's chest, but he held his ground. "I remember plenty. Remember following orders that turned out to be lies. Remember women and children dead because we didn't question why." "War is war," Morris said flatly. "And this ain't war, it's business. Simple exchange of goods for cash." "She's not goods. She's my promised wife." Laughter rippled through the group, harsh as crows. "That true?" Morris called toward the cabin. "Come on out, lady. Tell us if you really mean to marry old One-Eye here." Ava's voice came from the doorway, steady and clear. "I do mean to, under God's blessing and law." She stepped onto the porch beside Gideon, her presence both gentle and immovable. The men fell quiet, perhaps surprised by her calm dignity. "Ma'am," Morris said finally, touching his hat brim. "No offense meant, but there's some serious charges laid against you. Theft, fraud." "Those charges were cleared," Gideon cut in. "Marshal Klein himself confirmed it." Morris shrugged. "Papers we saw say different. Course, if you'd rather ride to town, sort it out proper like." "We're not riding anywhere." Gideon's hand stayed well away from his gun, but his stance shifted subtly. "And you're not taking her." The afternoon stretched taut as a bowstring. Morris and his men exchanged glances, then began setting up camp just beyond the cabin's clearing. Their message was clear. They could wait. "Persistent bunch," Ava observed quietly as she started supper preparations. The clatter of pots and the homey scent of baking bread filled the cabin, as if deadly serious men weren't lounging outside their door. Gideon paced by the window, watching the men set up their bedrolls. "They won't leave without trying something. Then we must pray they see truth before violence spoils what God has mended." Ava's hands remained steady as she worked dough. "You've come too far to let old ghosts drag you back to darkness." "They're not ghosts," Gideon said roughly. "They're flesh and blood men who mean to take you by force. And you're a flesh and blood man who's learned better ways?" She looked up at him, her eyes full of quiet certainty. "Violence will undo everything. Your healing, your peace, the example you've set for Micah. Trust that the Lord has better answers." Micah sat at the table, his half-carved horse forgotten as he watched them both. "Are they bad men, Gideon?" The question hung heavy in the air. Gideon thought carefully before answering. "They're men who forgot how to tell right from wrong, like I did once." He ruffled the boy's hair. "But God has ways of reminding us, if we're willing to learn." Evening crept in like purple shadows through the pines. Ava served supper as always, though Gideon noticed she'd made extra, enough to feed visitors if needed. They ate quietly, the familiar routine of prayer and shared bread somehow more precious under threat. As night fell, Gideon made his preparations with methodical care. He checked his rifle, loading it with practiced hands before propping it beside the door. A second gun went under his pillow, but before lying down, he knelt beside his bed, something that would have been unthinkable months ago. "Lord," he whispered, "I aim to protect what you've given me, but show me how to do it your way, not mine." He settled onto his pallet near the door, listening to the soft sounds of Ava and Micah sleeping in the back room. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the ridge. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, 5 men who shared his violent past waited in the darkness, testing his newfound faith against old habits of anger and blood. Gideon lay awake long into the night, one hand near his rifle, praying his promise of restraint wouldn't cost more than he could bear to lose. Dawn crept over the mountain with pale fingers of light. Frost glittered on bare branches, and thin wisps of smoke rose from the bounty hunter's camp. Gideon had dozed fitfully, never fully sleeping, his hand never far from his rifle. A sharp crack split the morning silence. Gideon bolted upright as orange flames erupted from the wooden shed where they stored winter supplies. Morris's voice carried across the yard. "Time's up, Stroud. Send her out or we'll smoke you all out." Ava appeared from the back room, her face calm despite the fear in her eyes. "They mean to force our hand." "Get back inside," Gideon ordered, checking his rifle. The familiar weight of the weapon stirred old instincts, but Ava's teachings held them in check. He wouldn't kill unless forced, but he would protect his family. More shots rang out, splintering wood around the cabin's windows. Micah darted across the yard, running from where he'd been checking his pony. Bullets kicked up dirt at his feet. "Get down!" Gideon shouted. He fired 2 warning shots over the bounty hunters' heads, making them duck behind trees and boulders. "That the best you can do?" Morris taunted. "The one-eyed ghost of Granite Ridge turned into a prairie dog!" Gideon's finger tightened on the trigger, old rage rising. He could pick them off easily. He knew their habits, their weaknesses, but Ava's words echoed in his mind. Violence will undo everything. Instead, he called out, "Last chance to ride away. I won't kill you, but I won't let you take her." Noble words from a man who helped slaughter women and children. The star-scarred rider's voice dripped contempt. "What happened to the killer we knew?" "He died," Gideon's voice boomed across the clearing. "God's mercy killed him." Laughter answered him, followed by more shots. The shed's flames grew higher, threatening to spread to the cabin. Smoke began to fill the cold morning air. Micah was still caught in the open, crouched behind a water barrel. Terror showed plain on his young face as bullets whined overhead. Ava moved toward the door. "No," Gideon tried to stop her, but she slipped past him. "He's just a boy," she said. "I won't let him die for my sake." She darted out onto the porch. "Stop shooting," she called. "If you want me, come take me. Just leave them be." "Ava, get back inside!" Gideon's heart thundered as he provided covering fire, careful to aim wide. He wouldn't break his promise not to kill, even now. She ignored him, moving swiftly toward Micah. The bounty hunters held their fire, perhaps surprised by her boldness. She reached the boy, wrapping protective arms around him. Then everything happened at once. Morris shouted something unintelligible. A rifle cracked from the trees. Ava jerked suddenly, red blooming across her shoulder. She collapsed, pulling Micah down with her. "No!" The scream tore from Gideon's throat. He ran to them, heedless of bullets, gathering her bleeding form in his arms. Micah scrambled up, tears streaming down his face. Silence fell across the clearing. The bounty hunters emerged from cover, horror visible even at a distance. This wasn't what they'd intended. Wounded women hadn't been part of their plan. "Stroud," Morris called, his voice shaken. "We didn't mean—" "Get out!" Gideon roared. "Get out, or I swear I'll kill every last one of you!" They mounted quickly, spurring their horses away through the trees. The thunder of hooves faded, leaving only the crackle of the burning shed and Ava's labored breathing. Gideon carried her inside, blood soaking through his coat. Her skin was pale as fresh snow, but her eyes remained clear and focused on his face. Micah ran ahead, clearing the table with one sweep of his arm. "The medicine box," Ava whispered. "Under the bed." Micah retrieved it while Gideon laid her gently on the table. His hands shook as he cut away her bloody clothing. The bullet had struck high in her shoulder, missing her heart, but leaving an ugly wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "Tell me what to do," he pleaded. "You're the healer. Tell me how to fix this." She tried to smile through her pain. Yarrow, to stop bleeding. Willow bark, for pain. But first, she grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't follow them." "They shot you." The rage burned hot in his chest, demanding vengeance. "They deserve—" "Promise me." Her grip tightened. "Don't let hatred win again. Micah needs you whole." Fresh snow began falling outside, dusting the windowsills with white. Gideon stared at the ceiling, tears burning in his one good eye. "Lord," he screamed internally, "you can't take her. Not when I've just learned to live again. Not when she's shown me your light." Ava's blood seeped through the bandages as he worked, following her whispered instructions. Micah helped, his small hands steady as he passed supplies. The boy's quiet strength shamed Gideon's rage, reminded him of all Ava had taught them about grace. "You'll be fine," he told her, trying to convince himself. "You have to be fine. We're supposed to marry, remember? Build a life here?" She touched his cheek with cold fingers. "Life is what God gives us. Every moment precious." Her eyes drifted closed. "So grateful. He gave me you both." "No." Gideon pressed harder on the wound. "Stay with me. You can't leave. You're the only light I've known in years." Snow fell thicker outside, its silence a mockery of his anguish. Micah pressed against his side, small shoulders shaking with sobs. Together they watched Ava's breathing grow shallow, her skin taking on a ghostly pallor. Gideon's hands, once so skilled at dealing death, felt useless now in trying to preserve life. The urge to mount up and hunt down Morris's gang clawed at him. He knew their likely trail, knew how to track them through snow. 5 more bodies wouldn't burden his conscience. He'd killed more for less reason during the war. But Ava's words held him fast. Don't let hatred win again. He sank to his knees beside the table, still clutching her cold hand. "Lord," he whispered hoarsely, "I don't understand your ways, but she's yours more than mine. She's always been yours." His voice broke. "If you want her back, at least help me keep my promise to her. Help me choose mercy over vengeance, even now." Snow continued falling outside as morning crept toward noon. Inside the cabin, Gideon knelt beside his wounded love, torn between rage and grace, while heaven seemed to hold its breath. The night stretched endless and cold. Gideon sat motionless beside Ava's still form on the table, his rifle laid across his knees. The cabin's single lamp cast wavering shadows on the rough-hewn walls while snow continued falling outside, muffling all sound except Ava's shallow breathing. Micah had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled in Gideon's old buffalo robe near the hearth. The boy's face, even in sleep, bore traces of dried tears. Every so often he would stir and whimper, as if fighting off bad dreams. Gideon understood those dreams all too well. His own mind kept replaying the morning's violence. The crack of rifles, Ava's body jerking as the bullet struck, the bloom of red against her dress. His fingers tightened on the weapon in his lap. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. He'd packed supplies already, ammunition, dried meat, coffee, everything needed for tracking. The snow would make it easy to follow Morris and his men. They'd left clear trails heading north, toward the old mining camps. Gideon knew those paths like he knew his own scars. He could find them before they reached shelter. Ava stirred weakly on the table. Despite Gideon's best efforts with her medicines, fever had set in by nightfall. Her skin burned beneath his touch as he replaced the damp cloth on her forehead. "Rest easy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear. "Dawn's coming soon." Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't quite catch. He leaned closer, and her next whisper came clearer. "You were right, to buy me." "Hush now," he said. "Save your strength." "But I was never for sale." Her eyes opened briefly, bright with fever but somehow still clear. "Remember that, when you ride out." Gideon's throat tightened. Even now she read his heart too well. "I have to make this right," he said roughly. "They can't just ride away after what they did." She didn't answer, having slipped back into uneasy sleep. But her words echoed in his mind as the hours crept past. Never for sale. What had she meant by that? He'd paid $5 in that saloon to save her from worse men, but she'd transformed that shameful transaction into something holy, a divine appointment that had changed everything. The first gray light of dawn finally crept through frosted windows. Gideon stood, joints cracking from the long night's vigil. He checked Ava's bandages one last time, relieved to find the bleeding had mostly stopped. Her fever still burned hot, but her breathing seemed steadier. He scrawled a note for Micah, explaining where to find more yarrow and willow bark if needed. The boy knew Ava's healing ways better than Gideon did. He'd have to trust him to tend her while he was gone. The morning air bit sharp and clean as Gideon mounted his horse. Fresh snow had smoothed the valley into unmarked white, except for the clear trail leading north. His breath frosted in the stillness as he touched his heels to the horse's flanks. The ride took most of the morning. He followed the tracks through stands of pine and across frozen creeks, climbing steadily into rougher country. Around midday, he spotted smoke rising from a sheltered draw. Careless of them, but they'd probably assumed he wouldn't leave Ava to pursue them. Gideon dismounted and moved forward on foot, rifle ready. The familiar weight of the weapon awakened old instincts. The steady hands, the silent step, the cold focus that had made him such an effective scout during the war. He worked his way around the draw's rim until he had a clear view of their camp. What he saw made him pause. The 5 men hadn't fared well in their flight. Their horses stood hunched against the cold, looking played out. One man lay wrapped in blankets, clearly wounded, probably caught by one of Gideon's warning shots. Another sat apart from the group, boots off, examining blackened toes. Even from this distance, Gideon recognized the signs of frostbite. Morris himself stood by their meager fire, looking nothing like the confident man who'd taunted Gideon the day before. His shoulders sagged as he tried to warm his hands over the flames. Gideon's finger tightened on the trigger. It would be easy. They were bunched together, unaware. 5 shots would end it. No one would blame him, given what they'd done to Ava. But her fever-bright eyes flashed in his memory. Never for sale. What had she truly given him in exchange for those $5? Not just healing for his wounds, but something far more precious, a way back to his own humanity. She'd shown him that mercy wasn't weakness, that grace had more power than violence to transform lives. If he killed these men now, he'd undo everything she'd taught him. He'd prove Morris right about being nothing more than a killer. Gideon lowered his rifle. The movement must have made some small sound, because Morris's head snapped up, hand reaching for his gun. "Don't!" Gideon called out, stepping into view. "I'm not here to shoot anyone." The camp erupted in motion. Those who could scrambled for weapons, but their cold, numbed fingers fumbled with holsters and rifle actions. The wounded man tried to rise, but fell back with a groan. "Then why are you here?" Morris's voice cracked with tension. His gun was aimed at Gideon's chest, but the hand holding it trembled. "Because someone taught me better than revenge." Gideon set his rifle down carefully. "Your man there needs tending, or he'll lose those toes to the frost. The other one's wound needs cleaning, or infection will set in." Confusion crossed Morris's face. "You're offering to help, after what we did?" "Yes." The word came easier than Gideon expected. "There's been enough harm done." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Morris slowly lowered his gun. "Why?" "Because she would." Gideon moved towards the man with frostbite, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "The woman you shot, she's a healer. She showed me that mercy matters more than justice sometimes." "She alive?" The question came soft, worried. "By God's grace, yes." Gideon knelt beside the frost-bitten man, who watched him with wary eyes. "Though it was a near thing. Now let me see those feet." The next hour passed in focused work. Gideon had learned enough from Ava to know the basics of treating frostbite and bullet wounds. He used snow to gradually warm the blackened toes, then wrapped them in spare cloth. The wounded man's injury proved shallow. The bullet had only grazed his ribs, but needed cleaning to prevent infection. As he worked, the tension in the camp slowly eased. Morris brought him coffee, strong and bitter. The others began talking in low voices, sharing what supplies they had left. "We didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," Morris said finally, staring into his cup. "Just needed the bounty money. Times are hard." "Times are always hard," Gideon replied. "But there are better ways than hunting innocent women." "Innocent?" One of the other men spoke up. "She stole that payroll money." "To feed starving families on the reservation," Gideon said. "And she's been working to pay it back through healing. Ask anyone in the valley. She saved more lives than that money was worth." Silence fell again, broken only by the pop of burning wood and the wound's man's occasional grunts of pain as Gideon finished bandaging him. "What will you do now?" Morris asked, as Gideon packed up the medical supplies. "Ride home. Take care of my family." He looked each man in the eye. "And hope you'll choose better paths from here on." "The bounty." "Let it go," Gideon cut him off, "or I might remember I'm not always this merciful." He mounted up as the sun began westering, leaving them to make their own choices. As he rode home through the gathering dusk, word of what had happened was already spreading. He passed 2 Ute hunters, who raised their hands in greeting rather than turning aside. Near the creek, old Watson the trapper called out a blessing. By nightfall, when he reached his cabin, he found 3 women from the reservation had come to help tend Ava. They nodded approval at his return without blood on his hands. Their presence was answer enough to his choice of mercy over vengeance. Inside, Ava's fever had broken. She lay pale but peaceful on the bed they'd moved her to, while Micah slept in a chair beside her. Her eyes opened as Gideon approached. "You came back," she whispered. "Of course." He took her hand, careful of the bandages. "You taught me how." She smiled weakly. No, God taught us both. Gideon nodded, understanding at last what she'd meant. Some things couldn't be bought or sold. They could only be freely given, like mercy, like grace, like love itself. Days stretched into a blur of prayers and waiting. Ava lay still as winter snow on their bed, her breathing shallow but steady. Gideon kept vigil, leaving only when Micah insisted he rest. The boy had grown wise beyond his years, changing bandages and brewing willow bark tea, just as Ava had taught him. On the 7th day, Preacher Ellis Harden rode up from Red Elk, his saddlebags heavy with supplies. He stood beside Ava's bed, weathered hands clasped in prayer. Her survival defies medical science, the preacher declared, wonder in his voice. The bullet passed clean through, missing her vital organs. Only the Lord's hand could guide it so precisely. That same afternoon, Morris and his men appeared at the cabin. They carried armloads of split firewood and hung their heads as they approached. "We've come to make things right," Morris said, his voice rough with shame. "Whatever work needs doing, we're here to help." Gideon nodded, acceptance in his silence. Together they stacked the wood, and when Micah mentioned Gideon's idea for a chapel, the men offered their labor without hesitation. Through the remaining winter weeks, the small building took shape beside the cabin. Gideon and Micah worked side by side, fitting rough-hewn logs while snow melted from the eaves. The boy's hands grew sure with tools, his quiet determination matching his guardian's. When spring's first warm breeze swept the valley, Ava finally stirred. Her eyes fluttered open as morning light filled the cabin. Gideon was beside her in an instant, his calloused hand gentle around hers. "Thank you, Lord," he said aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing her back." Ava's lips curved in a weak smile. "My mission," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "to heal you. It's complete." She drew a careful breath, her eyes bright with purpose. "But God has shown me there's more work ahead, for both of us together." Gideon squeezed her hand, understanding dawning in his heart. Through mercy, they had found not just healing, but a shared calling to bring that same grace to others. Wildflowers painted Granite Ridge in splashes of purple and gold that June morning. The newly built chapel, its pine logs still fragrant, stood bright against the cloudless sky. Settlers from the valley and Ute families from the high country gathered together, their usual boundaries dissolved by shared joy. Ava wore a simple white dress, adorned with beadwork gifted by the Ute women she'd healed through winter. Her dark hair fell in waves beneath a crown of mountain blooms. Gideon, clean-shaven and standing straight despite his limp, waited at the altar in his best wool coat, his scarred face transformed by wonder. Marshall Klein sat quietly in the back row, his badge catching sunlight through the window. Outside, Morris and his former soldiers stood respectfully, hats in hand. Through the open door, spring wind carried the scent of sage and pine. When Preacher Harden asked for their vows, Gideon's voice filled the chapel with unexpected strength. "Buy me, and I'll heal you," he repeated Ava's first words to him, tears gleaming in his good eye. The congregation stirred, remembering that snowy night that seemed so long ago. Ava's smile lit her face as she answered, "And you let God." Their hands joined as surely as their paths had merged, healer and warrior made whole through grace. Bells rang across the valley, their joyful pealing echoing off the ridge. That evening, lanterns swayed in the gentle breeze as the community gathered for supper. Micah, dressed in new, store-bought clothes, played his fiddle with growing skill. The music danced over the tables where Ute elders sat alongside settlers, sharing bread and stories. Peace settled over them like a blessing, soft as the falling dusk. Gideon watched his bride move among their guests, her hands touching shoulders in greeting, her presence still working quiet miracles. He touched the worn Bible in his pocket, the one that had brought them together, and thanked God for the price of love that had purchased his healing. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.